Hi, welcome to valuationpodcast.com, a podcast and video series about all things related to business and valuation. My name is Melissa Gragg, and I'm a valuation expert in St. Louis, Missouri. I have the pleasure of discussing fraud and forensic accounting with Chris Ekimoff, a certified fraud examiner and CPA in Washington, D.C. Chris also serves as an expert witness in matters of SEC financial reporting, complex GAAP accounting, whistleblower, mortgage-backed securities litigation. I mean, where are you not doing stuff, Chris? Welcome.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me, Melissa.
Well, I think it's so interesting. I think you're going to get into some good stories for us, but let's first start with some basics. Like this topic, people get a little confused on like what fraud is, but maybe we can shed a little light into this forensic accounting world. Like, how did you get into forensic accounting, and what does it really mean to do forensic accounting?
Well, I really have two people or two ideas to blame for how I got into forensic accounting. The first is a college professor I had, Professor King. If you see this video, I hope you're doing well. Who was the local ACFE rep for the small school I went to south of Buffalo, St. Bonaventure University. So he taught a class on principles of fraud in financial statements that I attended as an accounting student at St. Bonaventure. Secondary to that, I had also had a love of, and maybe a little bit too early in my life, a love of the movie The Untouchables, starring Kevin Costner, where he plays the role of Elliot Ness, and their attempt to bring down Al Capone and his crime syndicate. One of my favorite parts about that movie is the somewhat stocky actor who plays the accountant is constantly walking around the screen saying, we could get him for tax fraud. We could get him for tax fraud. And everybody says, no, he's a murderer. He's a bootlegger. We can't be chasing him down for tax fraud. And then obviously, spoiler alert, Al Capone gets busted for tax fraud. So those two, I look at those two influences as really what made forensic accounting and fraud investigation kind of a part of my worldview and just a place where you could potentially get into an interesting career. And so I'd gone through kind of the regular accounting ringer, did a 5-year dual degree program targeted towards the CPA exam at St. Bonaventure, and ended up landing an internship at a Big Four firm here in Washington, D.C. to focus on the internal controls, or at the time, what was developing the COSO Cube approach to internal controls over financial reporting. Halfway through that internship, had the opportunity to shadow an individual who worked in their financial advisory services group, which housed what they called their FIDS group or their core forensics group, and really spent a day just loving it. They were looking into the way in which a UN program trading oil barrels for food in undeveloped countries was being abused by the people using that system, right? They were receiving more money than they should have, or more oil than they should have. And that really just sparked my interest as a way to take this accounting background that I had and marry that up with the interest that I was passionate about. And asked it at the Big Four, hey, is there a chance that I can move over into this group? And they said, well, think about it. You won't have the same internship offer that you might have had otherwise. So we'll see. But thankfully, about 6 weeks after the internship closed, they asked if I would want to move into their forensic accounting group, focused mainly on government spending. So defense contractors and government work here in the Washington area. And grew up in Western New York State, loved it, but moving to a city where a lot of things were happening was a great place to be in my early 20s. So jumped at the opportunity and have been working in the forensic accounting world ever since.
Well, that sounds way more glamorous and what I envisioned fraud would be, because whenever I started into fraud, my first case, it was like the first week that I had worked at this accounting firm, right? And they were like, you're going to go on this investigation. And I was like, yes, this is going to be so exciting. And I was like, where are we going? And they're like, in this little town in the middle of Illinois. And I was like, oh, okay, cool. Like, I'm sure there's fun stuff. And you're going to pay for all of this, like I get to stay there and da-da-da. And then we were shown to the basement of a law firm. And they were like, so you guys need to stay down here because the town's so small. They're going to figure out that you're here. And it was like, we were investigating a government agency. And then there was like death threats. And I was like, whoa. Okay. So this is not what I bargained for.
That's
like, I was like, I'm a number cruncher. Can we go back to that? So, but
in the sunlight, right? Instead of in a basement, at least, wherever it might be.
can we go to eat? And then the funny part, which you'll understand this, and then we'll get back to the real questions. But the funny part was that these guys were like auditors, right? And so they were used to working like 15-hour days.
Yeah.
And I was like, yeah, but I just started, and I thought that maybe we go like, do we get a break? Do we just go to 9 to 5? And they're like, no, we're going to start at like 7 and we're going to go to like 7. And I was like, what is this?
that wasn't in the pamphlet about work-life balance, right? How do we
there was no work-life, and it was literally like funneling through checks, like boxes and boxes and boxes of checks, which, you know, if you want to fall asleep,
yes,
or if you want to like lull your eyes to sleep, like do that for 15 hours straight. I was like, maybe this isn't my line of work. I don't know. But I think it kind of goes to the fact that, you know, people don't really understand what's in that space, and they think that it's very glamorous, and it's like you're investigating, like you're in the FBI or something. But what does forensic accounting mean to you and maybe to your clients? Because it's very different depending upon where you focus, right?
Yeah, it's one of those terms of art. Everybody's got their own quick definition for it. Mine, I like to tell clients and colleagues that it is accounting and finance under heightened scrutiny. And I contrast that with, you know, talking about audits, right? You brought up the auditors. An audit is a set service for a specific purpose. You know, ostensibly speaking, it's to ensure that the financial statements are, you know, not materially misstated under the accounting framework that they're being presented on. And that service needs to be provided at a regular basis, whether that happens, you know, through a bank covenant or because you're a publicly traded entity. You know, we can go on and on into the weeds on that. So to me, an audit is going an inch deep and a mile wide, right? We want to make sure everything is in order. Nothing is too far out of order. And if this issue or this error is under the level of materiality, we don't have a big deal. Forensic accounting and fraud investigation is almost exactly in the opposite direction. It's an inch wide and a mile deep. And we have one very specific issue or very specific set of circumstances that we need to understand or confirm. And usually it's ad hoc. It's not a repeat engagement. And I like to tell the joke, if you've signed us up for 3 years of you know, repeat investigations, you're probably not doing something right in-house if we need to come back over and over again. So for forensic accounting, to me, is that heightened level of scrutiny to a very unique set of circumstances. And that can be applied across a variety of ideas. You know, we believe that the CFO is embezzling from the company. Can you help us understand whether he is or not? And if he is, how much is gone? So you've got that very specific set of circumstances you're looking at. Or it could be, hey, we had this department on the West Coast for a long time that was humming along at, you know, $100 of revenue a day. And now they've popped up to $150 of revenue a day, and we don't understand why. Can you come in and take a look and see is something bad going on here, or are we just doing a lot better than we projected? So again, not really a fraud investigation in that perspective, but putting another layer of scrutiny onto the financial results you're looking at to understand what's really going on. So, I mean, the classical definition, the word forensic, you know, you talk about the glamour. I like to say the forensic accounting sounds sexy and cool. But again, I'm staring at a computer screen for 20 hours a day, just like everybody else. The forensic word, you know, its Latin root is actually for the forum is what it translates to, or for the law. So forensic basically applies to presenting something in a court of law or for a trier of fact. So a lot of times our work will be held up to the standards of a bankruptcy court or a civil litigation or potentially criminal litigation if an individual is undertaking some criminal activity based on the financial information that we're reviewing. So that's really a broad way to describe it. I have some good friends out in Oregon who run their own forensic accounting firm who develop a lot of the thought leadership in the area, and their trademark definition, you know, so out to Daryl and his guys, full credit where it's due, is the art and science of investigating people and money. And what that means is that you're not only looking at the ledger, you know, debits on the left, credits on the right. You're also looking at the intent. What was Chris doing when he took $10,000 out of the petty cash fund? What was the CFO purchasing when they, you know, wrote a blank check to a contractor to get their home remodeled? And looking at the people as well as the money, I think, is a very important aspect. So thanks to those guys at Financial Forensics who help define some of those ideas in the space.
Well, and I think that people think also of like the term that people know is like somebody's cooking the books, right? Mm-hmm. And what I've tried to explain is that if sometimes like the investigation is coming in and saying, okay, assuming that these financials are wrong, how do we back into what should have been correct? And how do we find the trail?
That's
because a lot of times there's always going to be a trail, because, like by definition, people who commit these types of fraudulent crimes are usually first time. They, we can talk about the fraud triangle. They have opportunity and things like that. But the reality is they probably aren't doing it really well. Like they're not career criminals that are doing this. Sometimes they think that they're really not even doing anything wrong.
That's right.
There's some justification. So, but like the type of investigations I'd been involved in are not nearly as exciting and as huge as some of the things that you've done. So just, for example, just give us one type of forensic accounting investigation that is of interest, that is like conceptually, what did somebody do and maybe how did you figure it out?
Yeah. So, I mean, the biggest engagement that I was involved with relates to this investment guy. I don't know if you heard of him, Bernie Madoff, New York City.
Never, no.
Real great career for a long period of time, but, just got the run to the deal. All kidding aside, obviously one of the most notorious, criminals and serial embezzlers in the history of the financial accounting world. But the role that we played in that, if you remember in December 2008, Bernie basically admitted that it was a Ponzi scheme, that it was a fraud. I worked at the time for a firm that got hired to be the expert witness for the bankruptcy trustee overseeing the Bernie Madoff investment services company to help unwind that business and to recover the assets from those people that they called net winners. And books have been written on this, and I encourage, if you guys are interested, to read more about it. Wizard of Lies is a great book that outlines a lot of the issues in the case. But our task as experts for the trustee were to prove out the elements of the fraud. So admitting to fraud is one thing. And again, fraud being the determination that comes from a court of law, more so than the actual activity itself. You can only prove fraud to a judge or a jury. Chris can't sit here and say it was fraud or not, right? It's a term of legal meaning. And so when you have someone who's admitted that it's a fraud, if you're going to bring an action against a third party related to that fraud, as in Chris gave Melissa $100 and took out $150 and then went on his merry way, meanwhile Steve gave Melissa $100 and got back $0. There's elements of the legal ramifications to that scheme that, Steve should get some of Chris's net winnings, as they called them. So to help prove out that case, we had to put together the excruciating detail of everything that Bernie Madoff did and everything he didn't do. Everything he did related to, the ways that he manipulated investors to give him more money, the way that he staved off their requests for withdrawals, the way that he printed up these statements that were believed to be fake at the time and then proven to be so through a lot of analysis from that point. And then to prove what he did not do, to prove out that he didn't actually purchase stocks on his investors' behalf, that he didn't go through and operate a trading strategy that was giving the returns that he purported to tell all of his investors. So the engagement itself, you talk about being in the basement, working 16-hour days. We were at a warehouse facility on Long Island going through all of the records that he had printed over a 7-year period. And just, it looked like Costco, right? You just had lines and lines of boxes of stuff that was printed out that we were hand tabulating and reviewing and checking for quality control so that we could support an expert in court who would make the opinion that this individual did not trade 10,000 shares of GM stock on January 1st because those trades didn't occur. We see no proof that they occurred, and only 8,000 shares of GM were traded that day, right? Or following similar circumstances. So that was a great kind of broadly focused, not only forensic accounting engagement, but great insight into the legal world and some of those nuances for how fraud works there as well. The other side of the spectrum, I've spent some of my time doing internal investigations for smaller companies. I used to work at not smaller per se, but I used to work at a global hospitality company here in the DC area, doing internal investigations for them. And so we'd be looking into individual hotel properties that were attempting to inflate their revenues, and deflate their revenues to avoid paying more in a franchise fee to the hotel company that they had their hotels branded as. So we would have to find a way to prove out that they actually had 100 rooms rented on January 1st and not the 50 rooms they reported. So we would go through things like the room cleaning logs at the property and see that, okay, you told us on your financial reports that you had 50 people stay in your hotel. Why did the maids clean 102 rooms the next day? Right. if I'm a hotel, that's not a great way to spend my variable cost, right? Is paying maids to clean rooms that are already clean. So you look for avenues like that to get around some of those issues and really identify some of the underlying facts, like you said, unwinding those less than perfect scenarios to know what's really going on.
Yeah, and a lot of things that I had gotten involved in the past was like those kickback schemes. And, when you're defrauding the IRS, it's a serious situation. Like you can steal from a lot of other people, but defrauding the IRS is not something you want. Tax evasion, tax fraud, not the one you want to mess with. But I think it's interesting because a lot of times in the accounting world, and even as being an expert witness, we kind of start doing these investigations and doing like really kind of it's not grunt work. Somebody has to go through and put eyes on these documents and know what you have to know whether you have a case or you don't have a case and what's the issues. But how did you kind of bridge the gap of doing some of these investigations? Because on these big investigations, you were so young that it probably wasn't you as the lead testifier. But when you saw these cases, did you get interested as being an expert witness, or were you like, oh my gosh, that's crazy? Like what were your thoughts? Like, how did you get pulled into testifying?
I'd say I was really excited for it until after my first deposition. Then I wasn't excited anymore. When you have a very intelligent and well-meaning attorney on the other side of the table trying to tear apart your entire report, your educational background, your general demeanor can be a little less than encouraging for pursuing that going forward. But, you talked a lot about getting eyes on documents. I like to say that you're looking for the smoking gun, right, in investigation, but you also want to look for the lit fuse. And the lit fuse is that bomb in the production, in the data that completely blows your methodology, your expert opinion out of the water. And you need to have that level of understanding of the facts so that you don't go up there and say, FIFO is always the best method for inventory accounting. Meanwhile, your client has written a memo that says LIFO is, right? And you just haven't looked at it. So from an expert perspective, you got to be, play both offense, put out the facts that support the case, on behalf of the client, with all the truth and integrity you can, and also be aware of the weaknesses in the case. And there, I don't know, Melissa, if you've been on any investigations or evaluations as well, where one party is 100% right and the other party is 100% wrong, because that's usually not when folks like us get involved.
Right. And it is, I think you get better with time, obviously, the more you testify. But the beginning, we were talking about this yesterday with another expert, and the beginning is kind of horrific.
Yes.
Like I had a whole policy of not eating when I had trial dates because I just didn't know, like I was always concerned, like if I had breakfast and it was like tainted food and I'd be on the stand and I just couldn't take it. So you kind of develop those things. But I think also where I've seen people successful is when they kind of stay in their lane.
That's right.
And so when you testify, so I really focus on business valuations and you're really focused on forensic accounting.
That's right.
And that's what makes us, excel in that field. But, from the perspective of a forensic accountant, what do you think are some additional challenges? Because not everybody testifies, right? There's a lot of people that do the work and that understand the theory, but not everybody testifies. Right. So what are some other unique challenges that you face as a forensic accountant?
Yeah, we hinted at this a little bit before. What I like to tell people the most is this is not like Ben Affleck in the movie The Accountant in the conference room, right? There's not one line that doesn't add up and he finally found it.
Right.
We're dealing with ambiguity. We're dealing with complex problems that, first off, are probably too difficult for the individuals involved in any case or investigation to solve on their own. And second, are contested by nature, right? So you're not getting drawn in to help adjudicate a case that's, like I said, all one way and none the other. I like to tell people that both sides have the same set of facts. And my client might want to emphasize 1, 2, and 7, and the other guys might want to look at 3, 4, and 9. And you have to kind of understand where they're coming from and play devil's advocate a lot as well. So, being a younger practitioner in this area, I felt like I had everything figured out on a lot of the cases I was on. Of course, that's exactly what that transaction means. Of course, he was stealing. I talk a lot about an investigation I had done with the hospitality company where we had received a tip from an external vendor for one of the individuals at the company who was alleged to have been running personal expenses through the account with the vendor that the vendor was then billing back to the company. And the vendor told us, this is completely inappropriate. This guy was a fan of the specific school in the Big 12. So he would fly back to football games on the tail end of his business trips to where the vendor was. And he would charge through those flights, would take people out to meals and everything. So we looked at all of his travel and entertainment expense. We looked through all of the time records and actually even did a kind of real limited social media review to see that he was posting pictures from the Big 12 game that he was at on the days that he flew there. So we sat down in a room with him. We pushed all the documents in front of him and said, can you explain this to us? And, obviously he's nervous, right? You don't want to be called in by legal and internal audit for any reason. But, he basically broke down and said, guys, listen, I knew this wasn't 100% right, but the reason that this happened is the vendor was looking to get another big contract from us and told me, hey, if you want to run some of this stuff through our account, we'll take care of it for you. It didn't go to the length of saying, and think of us when you sign that new contract. So this individual, knew, really that he was wrong, but he didn't just go out there and steal. He was kind of operating under this idea that we didn't even think of, right, when we were presented with this allegation. So it turns out the company didn't pick this vendor for the next contract, and the vendor was upset and reined in this guy, kind of tried to punish him for not selecting them for the next contract. So it was one of those really interesting cases where Chris sat down and said, I've got the royal flush, I'm taking the pot home with me. And out of left field came this whole other idea that explained the activity. And thankfully, the individual was completely forthcoming and paid back, I think 90% of the money that ended up getting spent, and took additional training and was under advisement and probationary periods going forward. So just an interesting kind of, I was hoping that, we'd get the TV scene or scene from The Untouchables where somebody kicks in the door and handcuffs him and takes him away. He had an explanation for it, which, did stand up with the facts, and we ended up tying out with the vendor. So a very interesting development there.
Yeah, I never really got too much involved in interviewing the people, because there's so much psychology in it. There's so much psychology when you're lying or when you're telling the truth. Do you have any good story? Because I'm always like, do you look up left when you're lying or right or which way? I try to read all of that stuff, and then I haven't even listened to what they've said. If somebody else is interviewing, I'm like, what are they doing? What are they doing? But is that really how it goes down, or is it really just kind of fact finding? Yeah,
I mean, from the specific interview room perspective, the golden rule, at least that I follow, and I actually took a training course from the professionals who administer polygraph exams for the CIA, and they would talk about lying. Awesome stuff. If you ever get a chance to take a course from a polygrapher, very interesting. But the key to identifying an interview is a change in the baseline behavior. And it's very similar to what a polygraph is, right? A polygraph measures your heart rate and the dilation of your pupils and sweating and things like that to say, okay, for 80% of the interview, he was at a baseline. And then I asked him a question about, where he was last Thursday, and the heart rate spiked or the pupils dilated. So similar in an interview, an admission seeking interview, which is where you have the target of the investigation or the subject of the investigation across the table, and you want them to fess up because you think you know what they did. You want to establish that baseline. So those indicators of looking up and to the left, or sitting back in the chair and then sitting forward, by themselves are not, there's no trump card there, right? There's no smoking gun for the interview. But if you notice an abrupt change in a variety of behaviors, if they talk in long, free flowing sentences and then immediately become short, if they seem very relaxed and casual and become very rigid, or the inverse, right? If someone who's lying has to put on this kind of entertainer persona, they might turn into the smoothest talking guy or gal you've ever seen after they seem like a pretty, straight, stand up and straightforward person, right? So noticing those changes is really where it comes in. And what it tells you is there's more there than the words that might be coming out of their mouth. So at no point will you see a judge rule that an individual, conducted fraud because they looked up and to the left. But those are all indicators for folks like us to get a little bit more information than maybe what's coming out of their mouth.
Well, and that's an interesting, you kind of just touched on it one time, and you talked about it beforehand, but we as expert witnesses do not go into any court and say somebody committed fraud.
That's right.
That is really a legal conclusion. So we go in and we say, look at the path. Here's the path. And that's where I think it's interesting, because when you start a new case or somebody comes and they're like, okay, we got this case. Here's the the issues, we think so-and-so did this, or, I did a lot of government work. So it was always like a city manager taking all the money.
Yep.
We think he did this, but we don't know. So how much do you think he took? And the weird part, and this is not just forensic accounting, but it's any type of litigation. There's usually so much information that first we have to go through it all.
Yep.
And in big cases, if you have rooms and rooms and rooms of documents, it's just a whole different ball game.
Yeah.
But now, kids these days don't understand how much technology has changed this process.
It's true.
And so maybe talk a little bit about how you integrate technology into this process, because we used to do it all by hand, right? Ticking and tying and adding up all these millions of checks to see, and you don't know until you get to the end. And if you miss some, you don't know until you get to the end.
That's right.
But technology really is a game changer in this space because it allows us to do more with less time.
That's right.
So what are some things that you're doing?
The three most important letters I've learned as an investigator over the past 20 years are OCR. Melissa, do you know what OCR stands for?
I think so.
I'm sure you know what it means, but the stand for is optical character recognition. And that's where you've got a computer program that reads the check for you. So instead of Melissa flipping through 10,000 pages, each with the canceled check on it, you run a computer program that in, I don't know, an hour, if it's 10,000 or maybe even less time, puts together a table of information in Excel or in a database format that pulls the $1,000 amount off, pulls the payee off the check, pulls the date the check was written, and categorizes that information for you. So that's the way that we really cut through that initial review period. And that goes for bank statements, that goes for email review, right? OCRing, and generally speaking, is really what the game changer has been in terms of doc review. And what that does is it lets you get to the anomalies, right? If you see, if you know that an individual has a annual contract with a cell phone provider and they make one payment a month, every month, 12 times a year to the cell phone provider, on behalf of the business, that's great. You can immediately, instead of going through 10,000 checks and trying to find out a year that had 11 payments in it or 13 payments in it, you just filter the darn table, right? And that tells you cell phone provider payments, year 1, 12, year 2, 12, year 3, 14. Why are we making 14, payments to the cell phone provider in the third year? And you might go in and say, hey, they bought a new set of phones for their employees, so they had an extra payment. Or it sounds like this guy has a friend who works at the cell phone business and they're working a kickback scheme. So instead of having to spend weeks categorizing and potentially, having troubles with data entry, right, is another huge way that OCRing gets fixed. Is Melissa and Chris aren't there with our 10 keys, God, RIP 10 keys, wherever they're at these days, and adding machines, trying to tabulate all these checks when you can pull that information directly from there. And obviously we quality control check it and we compare that to the total balance. We're not just going straight off the machine, but that's a way that we get to a higher level there of analyzing that information.
Well, and I think that, back in the day, because I don't, you're really the expert at this point. But, we also used to have to kind of data mine. So we would have to go into the computers and, there's the chain of custody and you have to, which just means you have to make sure that however you pulled it out, simple terms, you pulled a hard drive out of a computer. That's the original hard drive. Did you clone it? Where did it go? And so that you can prove, that it's actually evidence in some capacity. And traditionally in the past, people who have been involved in sort of that, more computer forensics and such, they were specialists in that area. And now I feel like technology is something that we use all the time. Do you see it starting to come together, that the people that are doing the computer forensics are also doing the forensic accounting, or do you see them as still kind of two separate areas?
You need to know what the right hand needs to know what the left hand's doing. So, at the firm I work at now, we've got a whole team of folks. I like to call them the SWAT team. And I like to say that they're ziplining into the company in the middle of the night and pulling out the CFO's hard drive and making a copy of it. But, from an analysis perspective, I need to understand that process. And chain of custody is, rule 101 of that. you need to be able to prove beyond all doubt, right? Maybe not reasonable, but that the analysis that you provided based on the information that you gathered, was uncorrupted. For example, if I'm, if my CFO is my brother-in-law and I'm mad at him for trying to divorce my sister, I might go in there and take his hard drive and say, hey, let me change some of these numbers and say, haha, look, he stole the money. And his defense to that would be like, Chris changed the numbers, right? This isn't something that I did. So you need to be able to pull that information, like you said, and it's perfected in an originating form. And I'm not a tech guy by any means, right? If you go beyond Excel, that's usually over my head. But I'm been in this field long enough to know that you never want to work off the original copy. So if you don't have a forensic technology group or digital forensics group at your firm or in the investigation you're doing, any information you get from a client or from a law enforcement agency or investigator, save it and don't touch it. Save a copy of it. If they give you Excel workbooks from an individual's desktop machine, take the copy, save it in a folder that says originals do not touch, move it over to an analysis folder or work papers folder, whatever that is, and then start working on the analysis and clearly mark everything that you're doing that was not originally found there, right? And we'll color code cells and we'll denote different worksheets to do that because we want to be able to, I usually use the hit by a bus analogy, but in the past year, I've learned that some people say win the lottery analogy, right? If Chris gets hit by a bus tomorrow, I want the people who are on my team or some other investigative accountant to come in and be able to walk the exact same steps that I did. Less macabre. If I win the lottery today and I'm not going to show up to work tomorrow, I want the folks who are coming in behind me to be able to follow that too. And that starts with, on day 0, client gave me workbook A, B, and C. On day 1, Chris copied workbook A, B, and C to, analysis copy workbook A. And then I start looking at it and pulling the numbers out and investigating that information. So you're absolutely right that chain of custody is very important. And a lot of times if you're on a case where attorneys are involved, they'll know their stuff in that realm, but you always want to ask the question, because you never want to be working with the associate who's on their second investigative matter, who hasn't thought about it. And then the work that you put together and charged the client for doesn't end up being able to be produced in court. And, you could have saved a headache from that as well.
Oh, I know. They even asked me to do that in divorces. They'll be like, well, go get the hard drive. I was like, no. People do that. There's certain people that do that.
Very smart and very diligent people will do that.
And, like, that's not how this works. And I don't really like going to do that because the people do not like you there.
Yes.
It's the same with all of the death threats. Like, I'm not for the death threats. I'm not that person. So it's very interesting. So a couple more things that I think is interesting. So you told a great story. Do you have any other good fraud stories you can share that are kind of juicy? I know in divorce, we always have really interesting stories, but let's nerd out a little bit and talk about some fun accounting stories.
Yeah, so we talk a lot about the numbers, right, and where did the money go? But a lot of times when you're sitting in kind of what I'll call a quasi internal audit role or an internal investigations role, you'll be asked to review qualitative information, non-quantitative information. So I received a complaint on behalf of a company at some point where an individual was alleging that the department head of the group that this individual was in was playing favorites with another individual in that group because they had a personal relationship together. So we, try to identify things from a financial or an HR perspective and didn't really see any other complaints until we took the download of their Microsoft Outlook calendars and we tracked their travel and PTO together. And so department head would go on a trip to West Coast office. Amazingly, the alleged personal relationship would have time off for the 2 days that person was out west. We then see, on the other side, the department, the staff person in the department would take a week's vacation, and also the department head would take a week's vacation the same day. So we took that information, compiled it, and put together a calendar over about 8 months that showed I'll say coincidences, right? We didn't take this to the level of hotel receipts and things like that, but we wanted the department head to know from an internal investigation standpoint that their conduct was identified as potentially being problematic, and they needed to explain to the folks that they worked with why that was the case or stop the behavior, right? So that didn't end in terminations. It ended up in a reassignment of those two individuals, so they weren't direct subordinates or reporting to each other in that facet. But we color coded the the males travel as blue squares and the females travel as pink squares, and they magically lined up in a way that looked like a really interesting mosaic. If you look at it from that perspective. So, I mean, personal relationships, right? I talked earlier about investigating people. That's always an interesting side of the coin. And then, one other story we did just recently, we helped they're not a private equity firm, but a company that invests in distressed businesses in an attempt to revitalize them and, bring them to profit. A lot of times they'll be interested in the relationships between the entity they invest in and other subsidiaries or third parties involved with the company they invested in. So we do a lot of public record searches and background checks and things like that on individuals and companies to help understand the spider web of relationships that they might have. So if Chris Ekimoff and my sister's married, her last name's not Ekimoff, it's Reed. You might not know on paper that we're related, but if Chris Ekimoff is contracting with vendor, Reed and Co., that's a relationship that a public record search might identify, right? Her previous last name was Ekimoff. So, we conducted a search of over 38 individuals and 50 business entities and found out that 90% of them were linked in some way, shape, or form. And that's between personal relationships. You can understand neighbors, right? Properties that are next to each other or in the same apartment building, and presented that back to our client who wanted us to do some due diligence on their investor, on the investment that they had made, and come to realize that the, $100 million of revenue and the $80 million of expense that was spent, that, 70% of that $80 million, or excuse me, 70 million of that $80 million was being spent on people related to or personal friends of the CEO of the company they invested in. So again, I'm not saying that they inappropriately, paid for services, but that's an investment decision that had the kind of quasi private equity company known, they probably wouldn't have gotten in with this organization because it was just so tightly, mapped together that it was hard to tell where the service is being market rate and where those relationships appropriate. So it was a wild spider web. I wish I could show the relationship map we had because it kind of looked like a Jackson Pollock painting with everything being connected in the middle.
Well, and the first story that you told is this kind of this whistleblower concept. So these companies kind of have this process that you can call a 1-800 number and anonymously leave a tip. And then the company will have you come in and kind of investigate that tip because they kind of need somebody from the outside. Probably. That's
right. Yeah. And they'll be done, depending on each company's different, right? So some of them will be held internally and there'll be HR complaints and like equal opportunity employment complaints or discrimination. And they'll bifurcate them all between different investigators and different topics. So oftentimes, my bread and butter is on the financial side. So inappropriate travel and entertainment expense, allegations of bribery, corruption, kickback schemes that you talked about a little bit. But sometimes, we'll be working with a company that doesn't have a strong compliance group. They outsource that. They have one lawyer that works in an external firm who's kind of their whole HR, legal, compliance, general counsel department. And they'll say, hey, Chris, I know you and your team does this kind of stuff. Can you take a look? And so that's where we'll get pulled in. And again, we won't opine on the HR side of the coin because that's not our specialty, but we'll be able to line up that data and that information to help them make decisions on how they want to approach those individuals.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. Well, why don't you tell us just a little bit? So I think people might be wondering, wow, he has such a great voice for podcasts. Oh, wow, he's pretty good at, look at, he's so official with all of this stuff.
Please.
But you actually you have your own podcast show, which I thought was really good.
That's right. Yeah. So a friend of mine, thank you for putting up the name, shameless plug. So a colleague of mine, a gentleman named Kurt Wolf, who's a practicing securities attorney, and I been friends for 5 or 6 years, met at a conference actually, and full nerd disclaimer, through using the conference hashtag on Twitter. We were trading messages throughout the day of what panelists were saying, and then ended up meeting at the networking event at the end of the day. And so had gotten to be friends over the period of time, and were approached by an organization called the Practicing Law Institute, or PLI, that provides continuing legal education to practicing attorneys. They have over 300,000 members across the world. And they were looking at kind of getting into this podcast game back when we were talking to them. And, Kurt and I kind of turned to each other and said, why don't we take this off Twitter and start recording some of the conversations that I know we've had? So we went live in January. I think we are about to put out our 22nd episode tomorrow. We're trying to provide, we call it the practitioner's perspective. So you might read a headline in the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times or Newsweek or any of those publications and see fraud, see insider trading, see bribery. But we want to go a level below the headline and talk a little bit about the law that underpins a lot of those issues, whether it exists or not. Melissa, I don't know if you know, but there is no actual statute that makes insider trading illegal. It is a set of previous cases that draw the case law, the common law definition of that. So if you want to hear more, please listen to our episode on insider trading. So we're talking about some of those issues, and we're kind of people in the trenches, right? We appreciate the journalists who cover it. We know they're working their tails off to get the right info, but we're providing that perspective of, I had a case that related to insider trading, and here's the specific issues we dealt with. Or I had an entity that was listed on a securities exchange and they got dinged by the SEC. Here's the reasons why. So, we think it adds a little bit of value. We kicked off in January and wanted to make a commuters podcast. Now that there's a pandemic going on, there's not a lot of commuting going on, but thankfully we've had some good listeners. So it's definitely been a long process and a lot of fun. And I know Kurt and I are really enjoying doing it as well. But thanks for the compliments. Hope you've listened to all of our episodes so far.
I think it's super interesting because the fact of the matter is, you can get all the training you want for business valuations, for forensic accounting, you can get credentials. But the reality is, the more you do, and the more you see 100 different ways that something could be stolen, 100 different ways that somebody could defraud somebody, 100 different ways, then that's kind of in the bank, your knowledge bank. So that when you see it again, you're like, oh, no, wait, I already know this. And it kind of, so in some respects, if you're kind of getting into this space, you need to listen to other people's stories. And then other people's stories you will see the trail, you'll see the path. What did, where did it start? How did you get there? And then you can kind of collect it as some of the stories that So that's where I think that it can be really beneficial to not only people that are in this space, but also that want to get in this space, because it is kind of exciting when you're not locked in a basement or, I was also locked in a non-heated, non-air conditioned cinder block cellar, which is where they kept all their documents.
Of course.
And I was like, so are we going to get a heater? How long so you guys want me down there? Should I wear a coat it was like, I don't know if I just had this sign on me that she'll deal with anything, right. And then I'd look over and be like, hey, are you guys cold? And they're like serious auditors. And they're like, what? We feel nothing.
That's
We're
right.
fine.
We only
It's
find
no big deal.
non-compliance. That's it.
Hush up. Can you be quiet? And I was like, can we chat? Can we play some music? And they're like, no, we're serious. Oh, okay. All right. But also as a kind of a final thing, tell us, so we kind of say this at the end. People are probably super interested in you now because we're kind of fun. This was a fun podcast, right?
Well, you talked a little bit about sharing those conversations, Melissa, and I give you a lot of credit too. Valuationpodcast.com has had some great guests, personal friends of ours, obviously you've had on as well, but I think telling that stories is important. And, I share the anecdote that, my dad still doesn't understand why I'm an accountant. His mind is that, the accountants are the guys with the suspenders and the green visors, the Ichabod Crane, or we'll have to cut this out in the edit. What's his name? Not Ebenezer Scrooge, but the guy who works for him, Tiny Tim's dad. I'm blowing it.
Goodness. Yeah, I don't know.
So yes, you'll remember A Christmas Carol. The bean counters, right? Piling up the coins on the desk. That'll come to us soon. And that's really not what any of our work has been, right? We're in courtrooms getting yelled at by attorneys. We're helping clients solve tough issues on dealing with unfortunate divorces where we've got to help the unmoneyed spouse know how much they're entitled to, or if they just think that they are living beyond their means. So a lot of that is much more human interaction and problem solving than, okay, tell me what accounts receivable was last quarter. Tell me what accounts payable is this quarter. So it is a different conversation, and you're definitely sharing that through your podcast too, Melissa. And I appreciate that.
I'm trying. Everybody's got some fun stories. I think I just like to hear them, and I like to talk about all this stuff. But tell people where you work, what you do, how they can. We're going to include all the information to contact you, but give a little bit about your firm and what you guys are focused on.
Yeah, so I currently sit as the Southeast Region leader for our financial investigations and disputes group at RSM. So if you guys know, McGladrey was rebranded as RSM back in 2015, the fifth largest accounting firm in the country. So we've got a team of about 60 people nationally that focus only on financial investigation and dispute work, mainly, centered in cities like Washington, Chicago, New York, LA, and Boston as well to serve the attorney clients and the major companies that we're working with. Our work is exactly that. Focused on internal investigations, response to regulatory scrutiny, whether it be the SEC, the Department of Justice. We've worked on PCAOB issues as well from an audit perspective, and work to kind of help clients solve those tough problems and get that heightened level of scrutiny. We also do a lot of what's called independent accountant or arbitrator work, where two companies come together in an M&A transaction and try to figure out what net working capital would be and then disagree about it 3 or 6 months down the road. Those M&A agreements will ask that a third party come in and help decide them too. So we do a lot of independent accounting work on that side. And that's really what gets me out of the bed in the morning is helping those clients, solve those problems that either, thankfully, they need someone like us to come in and solve, and they've agreed to that beforehand, or, really working through some of those interpersonal issues as well to get there. So if you're interested in more about RSM's Financial Investigations and Disputes Group, you can find us at rsmus.com. I'm very active on Twitter, both from a professional perspective as well as from a personal perspective. So you can check out at Ekimoff CPA to follow along with some of that securities news, as well as, my favorite college basketball team. And thank God the Buffalo Bills are 4-0 this year. You'll see a handful of tweets around that so far. And then the Insecurities podcast brought to you by PLI. You can find us at pli.edu/insecurities. We've got 22 episodes all across a variety of different topics. We've spoken with SEC commissioners. We've done episodes on whistleblowers, FCPA, and tomorrow's episode is on high frequency trading and issues with the exchanges and markets currently to date. So if any of that interests you, check us out. And if you got more questions, just hit me up on Twitter.
I love the play on words. That's awesome. Were you part of coming up with the name of it?
I wish that would be, the tumult of my creative, the apex of my creativity. But my co-host, Kurt Wolf, full credit to him is for coming up with that name. And I'm eternally upset that I wasn't as creative as he was. So kudos to you, Kurt.
Well, and that's the problem in our space. Like, we're really good at numbers, but creativity, not so much. Mm-hmm. I mean, I was super creative, valuationpodcast.com.
That's right.
Right? I mean, went out on a ledge there.
I don't know why it wasn't snapped up before, right, by some other group, but
exactly. Well, we appreciate your time, and we'll probably have you back on to tell more stories. Maybe we'll get Kurt on here. We can just shoot the poo all day long, right?
Well, we're well seasoned, right? After 22 episodes. So happy to do it anytime. Thanks so much for the opportunity.
All right. Thank you. Talk to you soon.
You got it.